In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intention to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group, such as their mechanism of the engagement of the War on David, which is the systematic targeting of American leadership in order to engage in the genocide of the free society of these United States, as well as the subordinate policies and cultures and societies and genetic lines and posterities which would facilitate from the free society and its engagements with the rest of the international community, such as the development into the assumption of David's character generating a first world country, which would collect for itself its own society, at which point it would become its own ethnical, racial group, at which point it is its own society. Now, the obstructions in these cases includes the development of the obstruction of the educated answer on the settled societal arrangements, such as the social contracts from those societies, at which point the acts of engagement of malicious terrorism in these subversions, such as their obstructions of the rights of associations and contracts, etc., which would be normal to a free society, are obstructed for the express purpose of manifesting these genocides, at which point you have the complete eradication of targeted groups which are not legally targeted under American or international law, but are targeted under the Confederate interest of overthrowing the United States, at which point you have the entire eradication of entire genetic lines, which are condemned on the basis of being a genetic line. For example, their targeting of homosexuals under the assumption that they are a biological reoccurring feature from a single particular line, at which point their interest in the manufacturing of homosexuals, which is a function of experimentation, which is genetic alternation and genital mutilation, and many techniques which they have criminally obstructed from the public view as to not properly be analyzed by the voter in order to certify what is lawful in order to fund. These actions have actively engaged in these functions of genocides by the criminal function of these secrets and other fraudulent policies and laws and customs derived by the Confederate policy, which are secret from the Americans, and the secret policies are not American public expectation of law, therefore are not lawful in the United States, and therefore have completely subverted themselves as an alternative society of wizards engaged in hate crimes against the United States population and her allies. At which point you have the development of these functions, such as the referred to transgenders who have been forced into compelled genital mutilation, as well as other many subversions, which permanently destroy their ability to engage in the reproduction of their posterity, which is a violation of the Constitution's rights asserted, which qualifies the right to the reproduction, the right to maintain and develop and certify the maturity of the posterity, qualified from the freedom of association and such as the freedom of religion, which qualifies many of the association's ability to engage with each other. Now, these obstructions, in order to substantially alter under Plato's conspiracy, which is the function of conducting a secret plot against romantic interests, qualifying the government's, cultural rape culture. So these qualified rape culture systems certifies a wizard organization conducting the orders from criminal secret permits, certifying who gets to be in a romantic interest or association or other thing that is owed to them, which is criminally obstructed under the permits and interest and plays written by the poison script wizards, which engage in fruit of the poison tree by the use of coercion, which substantively removes the act of choice from the targets, qualifying it as a fraudulent narrative which the courts don't have a lawful right to verify because they are the victims of crimes and are not themselves making an actual legitimate decision. Now, the qualified position that they are actively under the constraints of the insurrectionist influence from the wizard spells qualifies that manipulation and coercion as a fraudulent narrative, which is fruit of the poison tree, which is not legal for the courts or law or science to observe, at which point the infinite compounding quality of bigotry, which is certifying the position of intentionally being wrong as to deceive yourself for a strategic advantage alternatively, qualifies your advantage to infinite generation of extortions, which is the corruption, which is the destruction of society, as you infinitely degrade the system into non-existence, which is the function of the development of the United States being attacked by a parasite which has actively infiltrated the system and qualified mechanisms in order to protect itself, so it's autoimmune of the general society, such as the engagement of law is prohibited from attacking the parasite, which is in reality the highest threat to the organism, qualifies the Confederacy as America's highest grade enemy, and thus those who support the Confederacy's breach of superior and inferior law for the generation of the alterations and change through the voter frauds and systematic lies qualifies them as necessary for the military to target and eradicate in order to engage in the substantive changes in the restoration of the general society under law from the thorough investigation and due process and due diligences, qualifying the original accounts from the shadow accounts or black accounts, certifying the restoration of the original economy back into capitalism away from the wizard communism, which has actively dismantled society and all of its advantages. Now, these developments of the acts of genocide in the subversions of the targets as to prevent them from the religions and associations qualifies the obstruction of people such as David's character, which would have engaged in many romantic interests throughout his life, many of which would have produced offspring, at which point the act of the obstruction from the rape culture wizard terrorism actions have conducted criminal use of force in order to substantively use violence in order to prevent the life of the fetus, at which point the ability to have inseminated the egg qualifies the development into a baby, qualifies that action, which was certified by the courts as saying that anyone who conducts actions or forces necessary as to have prevented the life of that fetus has engaged in the act of murder, at which point the acknowledged position of the status in sexual market value and assumed reproduction rate from the associations in question have to actively be tabulated as to acquire the original family for David Bowles and many other people who are victims of the same series of procedures, such as the acts of genocide, which have obstructed relations in order to substantially change what the families are, in which case you have one person who would have won the affections of the other, and you have a second party which is contracted with wizards who conduct the obstruction. The obstruction prevents the birth of the first party sperm with the egg, qualifying the act of murder, from the use of force as to prevent the existence and life of the unborn child, at which point these acts of murder from the rape culture qualifies as systemic injury to the general public through their criminal wizard permits, which are actively dismantling the stability and prosperity of the general public into infinite frustrations and retaliations, and these compounding frauds upon each other, misdirecting what the cause of the problems from their complaints are, generates retaliations against the wrong opponent, qualifying the exponential compounding of revenge societies, and the point that you have the acts of revenge societies, you culminate to the infinite insanity of the feminists saying death to the patriarchy. And to be entirely honest, as the patriarchy, I find that personally offensive. I haven't done anything to you. It was the fucking rapists. Just to recap, as a certification of their assumption that David Bull's character is in fact the sexual orientation of the patriarchy, the assumption that without the criminal obstructions, the associations and contracts would have certified the act of supporting businesses into supermodel companies, which David Bowles would have been started with, at which point he would have been raised with supermodels, actresses, highly educated women, in order to facilitate the maturity and high development to the interest of alternative investors in order to qualify the development of the schedule, which is criminally obstructed, which the courts would have to recognize in its full schedule and maturity to the certification of the development with their specific interest, manufacturing the natural result that the function of status and charisma by their functional self and in their system would be reproduced to the functionality of the definition of the patriarchy as the act of the primary interest in the development of David Bull's character, as to prevent the function of the rape culture from the Confederates being reproduced inside the American society, as well as through David's society, which would have been matured into its own separate country, qualifying him as the chief patriarchy, as the king of the first world country, which would have been started under the development and the schedule, under the qualified position. They assumed him to be the savior of Europe, as the patriarchy is in fact the definition. We have the act of the malice against the target under these beliefs, certifying their systematic defamations, certifying their criminal violence and contracts in order to enforce their defamations, generating fruit of the poison tree exponentially through their criminal enterprise and development and revenge schemes, such as their Portland Girl Office, certifying the acts of those who would have believed themselves to have been the exes, which would not have acquired the contracts necessary in order to acquire the interest to the hate groups, which have sent them in many cases, or would have actively found them in order to certify the advance of their definitions and development of their programs, in order to engage in the advantage of contracting with them, in order to certify the advancement of their wealth by the support of the romantic partners and their various interests to be matured, at which point the act of revenge is mostly a social protection against themselves, in order to certify that the hate group would not attack them, because the moment that the hate group assumes that the exes in question would have certified the attraction to the patriarchy, they would retaliate in their malicious racism, qualifying the position that they have certified the violation of the spell, qualifying a challenge to the Confederates' superior law in challenging the mechanism of their ability to engage in their lies and defamations, qualifying the act of being someone who is a specific threat in opposition to their system and its generation and permanent development. Certifying that, we should continue into the Article 2 of the Law Economy on the Genocide. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, or racial or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions and life's conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing the measures intended to prevent the births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, which is interesting for the specific assumption on the development of the surveillance human trafficking, which qualifies the use of the government hate group having control over the children, which have actively been targeted for abuse, rape, such as the Project Monarch, which is the MK Ultra variant of for children, at which point the children are functionally harassed with the surveillance as to prevent them from being able to engage in their families, even if they are physically being paid for by their families. The surveillance abuse qualifies the act of subversion and destructions and harassments, diminishing the targets, at which point you have the manufacture of anything that they could possibly want, including the act of defamation against them, qualifying the assumption that the black community is culturally deficient, for example. The act of saying this is a cultural issue when you have fruit of the poison tree manipulations by the wizard spells protected by the criminal secrets of the Confederacy qualifies the traumatizing of the general public in these target groups, certifying their trauma as the actual effect to the injury to their general prosperity of their group, as opposed to it being a natural occurrence. The act of it not being a natural occurrence is a criminal act by the surveillance terrorists, is a hate group function of the KKK and other subordinate wizard infractions against the American government, which they have a lawful obligation to enforce against, which criminally obstruct, such as, but is not limited to, the War on David, qualifying the ability to substantially change policies away from the policies that would have passed in favor of the Confederates through the use of criminal terrorism and voter fraud, qualifying the substantive censorship of the general public necessary information in order to engage in a legitimate vote, qualifying the substantive separation, certifying the negative effects of the criminal policies in order to cement the alternative government, and certifying the breach of the social contract in order to engage in the acts of genocide as well as other national subversions, and specific to the various targets and their interests. Now, it is important that we specifically limit the scope of all of the various engagements of the acts of terrorism. We should at least be able to hold up to a negotiation for a bare minimum of restraints against the infinite variation of the insurrectionist Confederacy, at which point the refusal to do so is the complete disillusionment of all sovereignty and legal government. Without this, you do not have states, and without this, you do not have states' rights, because states' rights requires a state by which to have the right. At which point, we should probably come up with something that has generically already been established as reasonable concepts that can be reproduced. We should probably avoid causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of particular groups which should otherwise be protected, such as every man being born equal under the law. In the general application of American history, this should also include every woman, at which point the certification of the development of our constitutional rights is that every person is born equal under the law and thus is a protected group, despite whatever their individual identity politics might be, at which point serious or bodily or mental harm has been one of which has serious bodily or mental harm has been one of which has required some level of cause to law to be interpreted. In prosecution A, Akiasu and ICTR stated that causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group does not necessarily mean that the harm is permanent or irremediable, at which point you have the 2003 Supreme Court case certifying that any intentional harm is egregious and shocking to the conscience, so at which point the intention to the act of harm without the act of enforcing the law such as the various engagements of the surveillance, are contracts to abuse, which are certifying criminal activity, which should be prosecuted uncensored and fully sentenced to the full extent of the law, at which point the intentional act of the injury is the qualifying serious bodily or mental harm, qualifying our development to any stable concept of a society, civilized or otherwise, certifying our development in the procedures of the rule of law, which is necessary to social contracts and the existence of society in any sane manner. Qualifying, we need to do this and we need to make these corrections. The existence of the arbitrary terrorist groups, unfettered terrorism by any mechanism, through any means, through any frauds, is unsustainable and counterproductive to any mechanism we could possibly tolerate. They are an active threat to national security and to the public tranquility, qualifying our obligation to protect our posterity from their various frauds and deceits in order to sell our children into slavery and to abuse, including the pedophile abuse market, which, under the dominatrix nature of the hate group function of the KKK, which has overthrown the United States in order to engage false originalism, qualifying the engagement of the use of secrets for the terrorism with the intent to make the harm, as a sexual fetish is interested in the harm of the more innocent, and the more innocent, the better. The more harm, the better. Thus, the larger the damage, the more the bragging rights. The more they are wrong before or after criminal activity is the interest to these acts of fetish, at which point the "I'm a bad boy" or "I'm a bad girl" qualifies the activity of what it is they're actively seeking, the emotional release, qualifying the fetish's attraction, qualifying its active reproduction and certification once they have acquired access to these hate groups and functions, qualifies the active malicious application of these fetishes in the trade of these criminal permits, which are protected by the Confederacy against the American law and public safety.